Imagine standing in front of your entire class, the room buzzing with excitement as students proudly introduce their parents. You're next, but your stomach churns with dread. Your father, dressed in his simple, worn-out clothes, stands beside you. He's not like the other dads, the doctors, the businessmen, the lawyers. He's just your driver. As your turn comes, the words stumble out of your mouth. This is my dad. He's our family's driver. The room falls awkwardly silent. Your father? He just smiles softly, as if he didn't notice the sting in your voice. But what if that moment of shame was only the beginning? What if, after that uneasy day, you arrived home to discover a secret, a life-changing surprise that would leave you speechless, filled with both guilt and awe? This is the story of one boy's journey from shame to shock, and a father's silent sacrifice that changed everything. Lucas was like any teenager, caught between wanting to fit in and desperately hiding anything that might make him stand out for the wrong reasons. He lived in a modest home with his father, Joam, a man who worked long hours driving an old rattling truck to make ends meet. To Lucas, his father was a source of quiet love, but also silent embarrassment. Joam was far from the polished, well-dressed professionals his friends' fathers were. He didn't wear expensive suits or drive luxury cars. Instead, Joam wore the same faded jacket every day and took pride in being reliable, even if his job didn't shine in the eyes of society. School was Lucas's escape, a place where he could distance himself from the realities of his home life. But that illusion crumbled when the school announced the upcoming Parents' Career Day. Students were asked to bring their parents to talk about their jobs, and suddenly, Lucas felt trapped. He imagined the scene in his head, his classmates' fathers boasting about their successful businesses, their engineering projects, or their high-powered legal careers. And then there would be his dad, Joam, who spent his days driving people around. Lucas loved his father, but the thought of introducing him like that filled him with dread. As the event approached, Lucas grew increasingly anxious. He spent days thinking of ways to downplay his father's role. Maybe he could introduce Joam as a transportation professional or logistics coordinator. But deep down, he knew his father would never go along with such pretenses. Joam was a humble man who believed in honesty, no matter how unglamorous it might seem. And so, when the day finally arrived, Lucas's nerves were on edge. When his turn came, Lucas stood up in front of his classmates, his voice shaking slightly. His friends had all gone before him, talking about their parents' impressive careers with ease and pride. Lucas glanced at his father, standing there in his simple clothes, hands calloused from years of hard work. Taking a deep breath, Lucas finally said, "This is my dad. He's our family's driver." His voice was barely above a whisper. The words stung, not just because of how he said them, but because of what they implied. That somehow his father's work wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough. The room fell silent, but not the good kind of silence. A few of his classmates exchanged amused looks, their smirks barely hidden. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, his face flushing with shame. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His father, however, didn't seem to notice the awkwardness. Joam simply smiled, gave a humble nod, and said, "I'm proud to do what I do to support my family." In that moment, Lucas felt a mix of emotions, shame, guilt, and confusion. He had always known his father worked hard for him, but standing there, watching his dad accept the judgment of the room without flinching, made Lucas realize something he had never fully understood. Joam wasn't ashamed of his life. He didn't care about appearances or the opinions of strangers. To Joam, his son's future was all that mattered. But what Lucas didn't know was that the real lesson, the one that would change his life forever, was waiting for him at home, in the form of a plan his father had been quietly working on for years. As Lucas left the school that day, his mind was spinning. The looks from his classmates, the subtle snickers, and the heavy silence from his father weighed on him like never before. He kept glancing at Joam, who walked quietly beside him. Lucas expected some kind of reaction, anger, disappointment, maybe even hurt. But Joam remained calm, his face showing no signs of the storm that Lucas was feeling inside. The truth was, João had heard everything, and though the words stung, he knew that this wasn't the time to confront his son. He knew that Lucas had a journey of understanding ahead of him. Once they got home, Lucas went straight to his room, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of shame. He collapsed onto his bed, burying his face into his pillow, wishing the day had never happened. He hated that he had let his father down, and worse, that he had let his insecurities control him. The weight of what he had done hung heavily on his shoulders, but he didn't know how to fix it. How could he face his father after that? Meanwhile, João moved through the house as if nothing had happened. He put on the kettle for tea and began sifting through some papers at the kitchen table, an old habit of his after a long day. But this time, there was a different kind of paper in front of him, an envelope. He had been saving it for this very moment, waiting for the right time to share his secret with Lucas. João had spent years preparing for this day, working silently and tirelessly to create an opportunity for his son that Lucas never saw coming. Later that evening, as the house fell quiet, João knocked on Lucas's door. Lucas opened it, still expecting a lecture, an awkward conversation, or some kind of reprimand for the way he had introduced his father at school. But instead, João stood there with a soft smile and an envelope in his hand. "Here, son. I've been working on something. I think it's time you saw it," João said, handing Lucas the worn envelope. Confused, Lucas took the envelope and opened it. Inside, he found several documents, letters, bank statements, and something that made his heart stop. An acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious schools in the country. Lucas's eyes widened as he realized what it was. His father had been saving money, scraping together every bit he could, to enroll Lucas in a private school that could open doors to his future. The tuition fees were enormous, far beyond anything Lucas could have imagined João being able to afford. In that moment, Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He felt his legs go weak as the realization hit him like a wave. While he had been embarrassed by his father's humble job, João had been working in silence, sacrificing everything to give his son the opportunities he dreamed of. Lucas looked up at his father, his eyes filling with tears, as the guilt of that day's events crashed down on him. His father wasn't just a driver. He was a man who had been driving Lucas toward a future far beyond anything he had ever understood. Lucas stood frozen, clutching the acceptance letter in his trembling hands. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of what his father had done. All this time, while he had been ashamed of João's humble job, his father had been quietly building a future for him, brick by brick, mile by mile, with every long, exhausting day behind the wheel. Lucas felt his heart tighten with a mix of awe, guilt, and overwhelming love. How could he have been so blind? He looked up at João, who stood patiently, his weathered face soft with the same gentle smile that had always been there. João hadn't said a word, waiting for Lucas to absorb the significance of the moment. "I didn't want to tell you until the time was right," João finally said, his voice low but steady. "I know you've always dreamed of more. I've been saving everything I could so that you can have a chance, a real chance. You're going to that school, Lucas. You deserve it." Tears welled up in Lucas's eyes as the full weight of his father's sacrifice became clear. João had never once complained about the long hours, the worn clothes, the creaking truck. He had never made Lucas feel guilty about their financial struggles. Instead, he had silently endured it all to give his son something better. A future filled with opportunities Lucas had never even dared to hope for. And now, with the acceptance letter in his hand, Lucas realized just how deep his father's love truly ran. But the turning point wasn't just in the letter or João's sacrifice. It was in the quiet dignity with which João had carried himself through it all. Even after being introduced as just a driver in front of Lucas's classmates, João had held his head high, proud of the work he did and the son he was raising. Lucas now saw what he had failed to understand before. His father's value wasn't tied to his job, but to his unwavering love and dedication. Unable to hold back his emotions any longer, Lucas broke down. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I was ashamed of you. But you've done everything for me. How could I not see it?" The words spilled out between sobs, his shame washing over him in waves. He had let the opinions of others cloud his judgment, And now he couldn't take back the hurtful words he had spoken at school. But João, ever patient, placed a hand on his son's shoulder and spoke softly. "There's nothing to apologize for, son. You've always been my pride. I've just been waiting for the day when you'd see it for yourself." At that moment, something shifted inside Lucas. The shame that had once gripped him so tightly began to melt away, replaced by a newfound understanding and respect for his father. This was the turning point, not just in their relationship, but in how Lucas saw the world. He realized that his father's worth had never been tied to wealth or status, but to the quiet strength and sacrifice that had built the foundation of his life. From that moment on, Lucas vowed to carry that lesson with him, never forgetting the deep well of love that his father had shown him, both in silence and in action. As the weight of his father's sacrifice settled in, Lucas's heart began to ache in a way he had never felt before. He sat on his bed staring at the acceptance letter, but it was no longer the prestigious school that filled his thoughts. It was João. Every memory of his father's quiet acts of love, every long day he had spent working to provide, rushed back in vivid detail. The image of João standing silently in the classroom, taking the shame of being labeled as just a driver, haunted him. Lucas realized, with heartbreaking clarity, that João had never once been embarrassed by his life or his job. He had only ever been proud of his son. Tears stung Lucas's eyes as the enormity of his father's sacrifices truly hit him. All those years of worrying about appearances, about fitting in with his wealthier friends, seemed so small and insignificant now. João had spent years carrying the weight of their financial burdens alone, never once letting it slip how much he was struggling, all to ensure Lucas had the opportunities he deserved. And Lucas had repaid him with shame. How could he have been so blind to the love that surrounded him every day? For the first time, Lucas began to see his father not just as the man who drove an old truck, but as a hero, a man who, despite the challenges of life, had never wavered in his dedication to his son. João had done more than just provide. He had sacrificed his own pride, his own comfort, so that Lucas could hold that letter in his hands, so that Lucas could have a future beyond anything João could have ever dreamed for himself. The realization crushed him. He had been ashamed of the very man who had given everything for him. Lucas's thoughts raced as he recalled all the moments he had taken for granted. The late nights João spent working extra hours. The quiet evenings when João would come home exhausted, but still manage a smile for his son. Every penny João had earned, he had saved for this moment, for Lucas's future. It was never about the money for João. It was always about love. And yet Lucas had been so wrapped up in his own insecurities that he had failed to see the greatness in his father's simplicity. Overwhelmed with emotion, Lucas rushed out of his room and found João still sitting at the kitchen table, the same calm expression on his face. His father looked up, surprised to see the tears streaming down his son's face. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Lucas choked out, his voice breaking. "I never understood. I was ashamed, but I had no reason to be. You've done everything for me, and I didn't see it until now." João stood up slowly, his eyes softening as he walked over to his son. Without a word, he pulled Lucas into a tight embrace. "Son, there's nothing to be sorry for. I've always been proud of you, and I always will be." And in that moment, Lucas understood the depth of his father's love. It wasn't the kind of love that needed recognition or praise. It was quiet, unwavering, and powerful enough to carry both of them through any storm. For the first time in his life, Lucas felt truly seen, not by his classmates or the world, but by the one person who had always been there for him. As Lucas stood there in his father's embrace, something deeper began to stir within him. When João finally let go, he didn't lecture or scold his son. Instead, he guided Lucas to sit down at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared countless quiet meals, where João had probably spent hours late at night, going over his savings to plan for Lucas's future. The old worn wood seemed to carry the weight of their unspoken history. João looked at Lucas with the same calm, steady eyes that had seen countless hardships, yet never lost hope. "Lucas," he began, his voice gentle but filled with conviction, "life is about more than what people see on the surface. You might have been embarrassed today, but you need to understand something. I've never cared what people think of me. My only concern has always been you." Lucas listened, feeling the full weight of his father's words. Joan continued, "It's easy to get caught up in how the world measures success. Money, titles, fancy clothes. But those things, son, they fade. They don't define who we are or what we're worth. What matters is the love we give and the sacrifices we make for the people we care about. That's what lasts." The wisdom in Joan's words hit Lucas harder than anything he had ever learned in school. His father wasn't a man of wealth or status, but he was rich in a way that most people overlooked. Rich in love, in humility, in selflessness. Joan had built his life on the foundation of hard work and devotion, quietly teaching Lucas lessons about strength and dignity that no textbook could ever explain. Joan leaned forward, his hands resting on the table, rough and calloused from years of labor. "I've driven that old truck for most of your life, and every mile I drove, I did it with one goal in mind, to drive you towards something greater. Not to make you rich or famous, but to give you the chance to become someone who understands what really matters in this world. And that, Lucas, has nothing to do with money." Tears welled up again in Lucas's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of shame or regret. They were tears of understanding, of finally grasping the depth of his father's wisdom. Joan wasn't just his father, he was his guide, someone who had always been showing him the path, even when Lucas had been too blind to see it. "Dad, I see it now. I understand what you've been trying to teach me all these years," Lucas said, his voice trembling. Joan smiled, a slow, knowing smile that came from a place of quiet satisfaction. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Lucas. Your worth isn't measured by what the world sees. It's measured by the love you give and the way you carry yourself. Always remember that." And in that moment, Lucas knew he had just received the most important lesson of his life. Not from a prestigious school, but from his father's quiet, unshakable wisdom. The next day at school, Lucas walked in with a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. Gone was the shame that had weighed him down the day before. He wasn't nervous about what his classmates might say or how they might judge him. Today, he was ready to face them, but this time, with pride in his heart. During lunch, Lucas stood up in front of his friends, the very ones who had smirked when he introduced his father as just a driver. His voice was steady, filled with a newfound strength. "I want to say something about my dad," Lucas began, and the room quieted down. "Yesterday, I introduced him as my driver, and I realize now how wrong I was. He's not just a driver. He's the reason I'm here, the reason I have a future. My father has sacrificed everything. His comfort, his pride, his dreams, just so I could follow mine. He's not only my father, but he's my hero." The room fell into a respectful silence as Lucas spoke, his classmates now seeing a side of him they had never known. This wasn't just a moment of confession, but of redemption. Lucas's heart raced, but not with fear. This was the moment he took back the respect and admiration for his father that he had once been too blind to see. He continued, his voice swelling with emotion. "The job someone does doesn't define who they are. My dad may drive a truck, but he's driven me to believe in myself, to never give up, and to always do what's right. And for that, I'm more proud of him than I could ever express." As Lucas sat down, a few of his classmates nodded in approval, others sat in quiet thought. The laughter that had once filled the room when they'd heard about his dad was replaced by a deep, mutual respect. Lucas knew then that his journey wasn't just about finding pride in his father, but in himself as well. That evening, when Lucas returned home, Joan was waiting for him, as always, with a warm smile, and though nothing needed to be said, they both knew that their relationship had changed forever. Lucas had redeemed not only his view of his father, but had reclaimed his own sense of self-worth. Lucas's life changed in ways he never expected. No longer was he weighed down by the opinions of others or the fear of judgment. His father, Joan, had taught him the greatest lesson of all. True worth is measured not by what others see, but by the sacrifices and love we give. Lucas now walked with a quiet confidence, understanding that his father's humble life held a wealth of wisdom and strength far greater than any material success. The bond between father and son grew stronger each day. João never needed to say, "I told you so." His love had always been unconditional, and now Lucas embraced that love with pride. The shame that once haunted him had melted away, replaced by a deep admiration for the man who had silently built his future. And as Lucas looked ahead, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges life threw at him, he would carry his father's wisdom in his heart, never forgetting the quiet hero who had driven him toward greatness. If this story inspired you, imagine what else is waiting for you. Don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and explore more powerful stories on our channel. Your next favorite video could be just a click away.